Religionists, in our past units, we looked at some reasons. Hinduism didn't travel in a big way to China, nor did Jainism. Hinduism, we saw, was tied to the caste system and Indian culture so closely that it wasn't easily or readily absorbed into alien cultures. Jainism is so ascetic that, in fact, well, the Jain priests couldn't even travel across the deserts or the Himalayan mountains wearing nothing. So Buddhism travels along the Silk Road to China, filtering in mostly through merchants and wandering monks, and in some cases the missions of kings. In particular, there's a little-known Buddhist empire, the Kushana Empire, that inhabits lands that are now Muslim, Afghanistan, Pakistan, large parts of Uzbekistan and the like. And so that empire was officially Buddhist, and hence the giant Bamyan Buddhas we have in Gandhara and the like, modern-day Kandahar, and named after Alexander the Great. So it was an empire filled with Scythian and Greek Buddhists. And the Buddha image will develop there and in Mathura, and what we'll see is Mahayana, the liberal form of Buddhism we might recall from the last unit, established in the north of Asia, central to East Asia, in fact. And so when Buddhism enters China, we already know well that China has established religions of Confucianism and Taoism. And we call China the land of three religions because, well, in the Chinese religious mind, if there is such a thing, one can be in all three religions at the same time. They don't have conflicting claims like Jews, Christians, and Muslims do. So we'll see China drastically transformed by Buddhism, but it goes the other way too. Buddhism will vastly transform Chinese culture also. With the advent of Buddhism, China gets spices from India, and all the Szechuan and other delicacies now are available to the Chinese palate. And so when we're looking at this Mahayana Buddhism as opposed to the Theravada conservative traditions of South and Southeast Asia, we see a very much more liberal Buddhism. Some things, in fact, the Buddha would not have approved of, such as making statues of himself. He said, don't do that. I'm not the focus. My message is the focus. And so for a couple hundred years, Buddhists refused to make images of the Buddha. But then the Greeks, with Alexander the Great, who famous for their images, couldn't help themselves. And so Buddhism becomes known as a religion of images in China, and the kind of Buddhism that will dominate is going to be this larger division, the Mahayana, the great vehicle of Buddhism, of our three Theravada conservatives, Mahayana liberals, and tantric Vajrayanans, if you will, the diamond vehicle we call it, which will emphasize the body, and the body as a means to nirvana and final awakening. So let's take a look. How does this Mahayana Buddhism appear? We can see some things in the Vimalakirti Sutra, for example, where this Mahayana Sutra, these are all said to be by the Buddha for the most part, although they're all fabrications of later ages, and hence the conservative Buddhists do not acknowledge their authority. But in the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, we see in chapter 9, a goddess discussing things with the Buddha's foremost disciple intellectually, Shariputra, who claims that a woman cannot become awakened or enlightened. And so in the middle of their discourse, the goddess swaps bodies with Shariputra and says, well, who's on their way to nirvana now? In particular, this Mahayana Buddhism was more popular with merchants. The early Mahasangika, we think they're the original of the 18 sects that will rise up into this vast Mahayana Buddhism, the largest in numbers of adherents for sure, that these guys started handling money and even having, sexual intercourse with partners and the like. And so this Mahayana Buddhism appeals even more arguably to women, but also merchants, because it becomes a type of Buddhism you can practice in your home quite easily. And so it expands the reach of the Buddhist tradition, more and more inclusive, and thus more flexible as well. Hence, This Mahayana Buddhism was capable of absorbing so many Confucian and Taoist elements into it, while some conservative Theravada monks made it to China, and there was some of that in China. Those largely died out. And so it's important to realize that this Mahayana division of our three, being more expansive and liberal, sees itself as the great vehicle, and the Theravada and other conservatives are the Hinayana, an insult for sure, don't call them that, because they only really allow for the life of a monk in the formal aspects of the tradition. In the thinking of all Mahayana Buddhist traditions as well, we may recall the thought of that great thinker Nagarjuna, who, influenced by the discovery of the zero in India, develops a whole philosophy around zero-ness, or shunyata, wrongly translated in my opinion as emptiness, or nothingness, but frankly, zero is what it's all about. And we remember the Buddha's own religion is about the middle way, and if we think of the zero, it is in the middle of all the positive and negative integers, and thus a hub for infinity. So for Nagarjuna, it's infinite in all directions, this world, and every moment, in fact, can be divided infinitely. There are no atomic time-space units like the conservative Buddhist thought, in his opinion. So then for the Madhyamika school of Nagarjuna, among the two big Mahayana schools, the YOGACARA, yoga praxis school, which emphasizes consciousness, and the zero-ness tradition of Nagarjuna, we see these emerge as the most influential philosophies of North, Central, and East Asia. For Nagarjuna taught not truth versus falsehood. For him, everything is true to some degree, but in a concealing way. So all words conceal because, first of all, they separate subjects from objects. And you can't separate a subject from its object. And please see the unit on Indian Buddhism to find out more about those arguments. And then this Yogacara school, the yoga praxis school, says, well, reality can't exist apart from a knower. The known must be known by a knower, and thus nothing could be known without a consciousness. Hence, the Yogacara, yoga praxis school, founded by Asanga, posit 8 layers of consciousness, not different consciousnesses. The 5 sense consciousnesses we all know so well, seeing, smelling, etc., but also a 6th, the mano-vijnana, that collates all those senses into a world picture. The early Buddhists only posited these 6, but the Yogacara go further and even outdo Freud with their idea that there is another ego level, manas, and that is where the James Powell resides, is at that level, and that is the target. The enemy is that ego consciousness. Finally, there is the alaya vijnana, the basal consciousness, and that, they say, is what reincarnates through time. So those are a few features of Mahayana Buddhism with which we should be familiar to understand what happens in China and Tibet. And it should be said that basal consciousness then is what reincarnates and also contains, like a seedbed in a garden, all your past karma from prior lifetimes, believe it or not, and that's what's going to carry you into the next lifetime. Even though these yoga praxis fellows agree with the Madhyamika that in the end, consciousness is part of a feedback loop, Buddha's original idea, in fact, and the consciousness itself has no self-existence, but being dependent on what the knower knows, it too is empty of self-existence. So those two schools simply really disagree about the reality of consciousness. Is it a complete fake, as the Madhyamika will maintain, so to speak? It's true, concealingly, but ultimately it is not. And for the Yogacara, for there to be awakening of a consciousness, then there must be, well, a real consciousness for that to happen. And so for the yoga praxis as well, my James Powell ego is just a projection onto nothingness. it is illusory, and yet it also exists as a reality, even though what I know, those things are all fake or imputed, we could say, projected onto an empty screen. So as Buddhism enters China, there's a big problem the Chinese have with even translating Buddhist terminology. We can see in the West this was a problem also. The Sanskrit word dharma in Buddhism means ultimate reality, but it also means ethics and behavior. It also refers to the alleged infinitesimal time-space units that make up existence, rejected by those Madhyamika we just discussed. But nevertheless, the dharmas of early Buddhism, all of these things go into this word. And so initially Taoists thought the Buddha was a reincarnation of Lhasa in India. And for the Chinese consciousness, as I understand it, India, the heavenly kingdom, is filled with phantasmagorical imagery and ideas that were alien to the Chinese civilization prior to the advent of Buddhism. Even in the West, early Buddhologists, as we call them, translated this word dharma as law, because the closest thing they could think of was kind of God's eternal law. And we can see, finally, in today's modern American and European Buddhology, we did what the Chinese eventually did in the transmission period that took some 3-4 centuries to develop just terminology to think about Buddhism. And so the Sanskrit term returns in China as it has done in modern Buddhology. No one translates that term. Buddhism is its own thing, if you will. And so it's important to remember that when Buddhism enters China, it is not a civilizing force. Chinese civilization is one of our 4 seats of ancient civilization. So Buddhism mixes and mingles in this transmission period, and in the process is influenced by Taoism and influences Taoism as well, and Confucianism to some degree, though Confucianists will be somewhat oppositional to Buddhism. Now Buddhism will be a civilizing force, and well, the old northern barbarians, as the Chinese know them, the non-Han Chinese, the Mongols, Manchu, and Tibetans. Their Buddhism will bring literature, government, all kinds of things that come with civilizations, just as Christianity will likewise civilize Russians, Germans, and other European peoples. So St. Cyril and Methodius developed the Russian alphabet, and likewise Buddhist scholars bring the Devanagari script to Tibet and these other cultures. So Buddhism will shape these cultures, but be shaped by Chinese civilization. As Buddhism enters China, it brings with it the things that appeal to people around the planet about Buddhism, notably the role for women. We saw in the Indian Buddhism that those early beggaresses, nuns, bad translation, sang hymns of praise that they could leave that jerk behind and get an education and be free of household duty. And so in patriarchal Confucian culture where the woman is to be obedient to her husband, Buddhism was a kind of proto-women's liberation. Not that things were completely equal there, for sure. As Buddhism becomes established by the 600-700s, it's big, very popular, a lot of money, kind of outclasses the Confucian and Taoist institutions. And so we see the emergence of great Chinese culture heroes like Xuanzang. Master Xuanzang traveled for 16 years on his way to the Kushana Empire I mentioned, and also down into India itself, collecting the Chinese Buddhist sutras that had existed at that time. When Master Xuanzang comes back, that's when we get new original terminology for Buddhism, and that is when Dharma is no longer known as the Tao, but by this time, as he calls it, Daruma, or Dharma. So in this peak period of Buddhism in China, the monks called the government coffers their inexhaustible treasury. And we can see the only time in China where an empress reigned is the Empress Wu, very devoutly Buddhist. She gave millions to build fantastic structures, monasteries for the Buddhists, including the famous mirrored hall of Fasang, one of the ancient wonders of the world. And in it, mirrors surrounded the people entering this dome-like structure, and in the middle is a Buddha with a candle, and when you're in there, you see your infinite self like a hologram, as Fasang believed the universe to be, reflected with a Buddha nature image in the middle of your own image in the mirrors in this hall. And so we can ask ourselves, would we like to see a lot of our tax dollars go to pay for, as the Confucian guys are going to kind of see it, guys to meditate on their navels and not be very economically productive? So her period represents a time where Buddhism is a powerhouse in China, as it will continue to be, although we will also see by the end of, well, the 9th century, 843 to 845, Emperor Wuzong is told by Taoist advisors that if he eliminates black from China, he can attain immortality, and black refers to Buddhism. Likewise, the Confucian scholars were none too thrilled then about this family and world-denying religion as far as they were concerned. So we can see in China, there were all the Buddhisms from India and local ones developed in China that didn't exist anywhere else really. But by this persecution of Emperor Wuzong, many of these are gone, as are tens of thousands of monasteries and some 30,000 monks forced back into the labor market. So the fancy Buddhisms, if you will disappear, but two will remain mostly influential. And let's just look at the first of these, the Qingde, or as it's called usually in the West, the Pureland school of Buddhism. In fact, goes back to India as Sukhavati school, or we can really better translate it, not Pureland, but happiness Buddhism. So again, they're all Mahayana schools, and the postponement of one's own awakening in favor of enlightening others is one of the principal ethical drives in Mahayana Buddhism, the ethics of the Bodhisattva. We saw this with the figure of Guan Yin as she's appropriated from Taoist sources into Buddhism. And so what of this happiness Buddhism? What's it all about? Infinite light Buddha is the focus, and when I talk to other Buddhists and I mention the Pure Land, happiness Buddhism, often people laugh, and it's not fair. It really is Buddhism. The idea is that for the poor peasant, and the persecution didn't affect the religious faith of the peasants, it lives on, and that's why this happiness Buddhism lives on as a kind of pie in the sky when you die kind of Buddhism. So it is thought that the infinite light Buddha, Amitabha, or immeasurable light, was once a human named Dharmakara, appearance of the Dharma. And he made a vow to attain full awakening and then save all beings. When he attained to the superconsciousness the Mahayanists believe are existent for the millions and myriads of cosmic Buddhas that the conservatives reject, and that Dharmakara becomes the Buddha of the West, welcoming the dying peasant into his loving arms. There it's said the peasant can train in Buddhism and thus themselves speedily make their way to Buddhahood also. And in that Pure Land, the descriptions are of lotus blossoms falling from the heavens, lapis lazuli floors, beryllium pillars, and I think you get the picture. It's pretty nice in the Pure Land of happiness Buddhism. And so among the Pure Land teachings, certainly, especially I'm thinking of Shinran, a happiness or Pure Land scholar of Japan, his view was that the scholars and the learned and the monks are actually farther away from awakening and nirvana than is the sinful, poor person. And why is this? The sinful or poor person has less of an ego than these important types. So we can call Amitabha really this faith a faith in the grace of a power that is other than the individual. And when this other power merges with my self-power, then that for me is awakening. And it can happen here and now in this world. It need not take death if I connect my consciousness with infinite light Buddha. Then I see this very world as the Pure Land. And in that sense, this is not a kind of Protestant or Christian Buddhism. It is still Buddhism, but granted, a very new kind of Buddhism in the world. So this Dhyana school, well, gets its origins, of course, they all claim to go back to the original Buddha, but specifically in China, it's the emergence of this monk, Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma travels from Pakistan. Rumor or legend has it he had red hair and blue eyes, and why, Chinese kind of thought he was a demon. In fact, believe it or not, he meditated for 9 years, staring at a cave wall, meditating so focusedly that he drills holes into the wall with his eyes. That cave exists to this day. One thing Bodhidharma noticed in China, though, and this again, the practice of Tai Chi and Taoist emphasis on kinetic movements as aspects of the religion. Bodhidharma says, well, our Buddhist monks just don't move around enough. And thus he incorporates martial arts into Buddhism. It doesn't exist for the Tibetans, and the conservative Buddhists just think it's madness. Buddha advised not harming even insects, so kung fu fighting is out. And so the Chan or Zen guys will tell you meditation's the critical factor, not book learning and scholarship. Words are a golden chain, but a chain nonetheless. So they call themselves a tradition outside the scriptures and a tradition of the silence of the Buddha. That's where they take this tradition. And so not many know that martial arts traditions have philosophical traditions that accompany them. The ninja follow the tantric Buddhism. The samurai follow the Zen guys. The Shaolin are also Chan or Zen Buddhists. And Kung Fu is the empty fist. The fist part's Taoist, but the Kong, emptiness, that is a Buddhist admixture. And so among the interesting practices of the Chan school is the use of the koan in Japanese or kung-an in Chinese. The kung-an was originally a Confucian idea of a legal case where something's publicly debated by two opponents and then a judgment is reached. But in Chan Buddhism we see, in fact, a very different use of the kung-an or koan. The koan is meant to jolt people out of thinking in words. And so the famous series of questions by a disciple to Master Unman, a few of them are like this. The disciple asks Master Unman, what is Buddha? And he says, well, Buddha is a shit cleaning stick. Well, you can imagine the conservative Theravadins and even the Tibetan Tantrins, they don't like that much. What's meant by that? Well, it's meant first of all to jolt the hearer out of the idea that Buddha is some kind of transcendental figure like those happiness Buddhists believe, or that Buddha is any kind of God, or that there is anything not sacred, if you will, or awakened. And thus the shit cleaning stick was used by peasants to push the poop off the old Chinese roads. Another student asks Master Unman, does a dog have a Buddha nature? And Master Unman responds with, woof! Well, that doesn't make any sense to normal people. But again, Master Unman in the koan, which is a one-on-one intuitional exchange between teacher and student, it is intuitional, not logical or rational. So rational arguments just don't hold much sway for these Zen or Chan kind of thinkers. Of course, the most famous of these koans is, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. We can't see anyone saying that about Muhammad, Krishna, or Jesus. But again, in this sense, kill the Buddha in your mind, the Buddha as anything other than the here and now presentness of our world. And in this sense, Taoism has been at work shaping and molding Buddhist tradition because the Taoists share a similar view about language and about hierarchical thinking, frankly. So in this, the Buddhists and the Taoists do disagree with the Confucian guys, but They're very distinct traditions, even though they interweave so nicely. So in subsequent centuries, we'll see a merger as well of Buddhism with Confucian thought that, well, we call the influence of Buddhism on Confucian thought Neo-Confucianism. So that's how much Buddhist logic of the two schools, Madhyamaka, YOGACARA, we mentioned earlier, influence the core thinking even of Confucianism itself. Buddhism will transform China just as the Jewish sect that swept Europe 2,000 years ago transforms the Greek and Roman cultures also. So there's an eerie parallel from east to the west of the Eurasian continent. And so that brings us to our third major division of Buddhist schools. The Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle it's called, or tantric Buddhism. Now some will say that the Mahayana was already polluted by Hinduism. That's the view of the conservatives. This one is even more shocking to all the other Buddhisms, and we'll see why shortly. First of all, tantra means literally, well, reference to the body, making the body move. This Buddhism will focus on this very body in a variety of stunning and interesting ways. One tantric Tibetan Lama I knew said, well, the conservative Buddhists, the Theravada, they're kind of like a monoplane aircraft with a propeller. You can cross the ocean to nirvana, but it could take lifetimes. And likewise, the Mahayana traditions like the Zen, Chan school we just discussed, they're like a jet plane, going to be faster, but it's not as fast as a rocket. And the rocket to nirvana, they claim, is their tantric or diamond vehicle, Vajrayana Buddhism. And so then, as we say, some see this tradition as Hindu pollution of Buddhism, and Shiva and Shakti then are back now in Buddhism, and we'll see among the practices the other Buddhists find so repulsive about this one is the idea that sexual union can lead to nirvana and liberation. Just quite the opposite of what the Buddha taught, as we may recall. Another distinction in this tantric Buddhism is the idea of mantra, mandala, and mudra, a new shaping of Buddhist practice. Again, we can see the Hindu elements in it. Mantras for chanting focus the microcosmic aspect of reality as our voices resonate saying the mantras. Om Mani Padme Hum is perhaps the most famous in Tibet, and it means, well, roughly Om to the jewel in the lotus that I am, and the jewel is indeed, in fact, a reference to maleness, and the lotus to femaleness, and the two together to sexual union, in fact. A mandala is a visual image, and even by looking at these two classic mandalas from Japan, where there is a tantric sect, it died out in China with that persecution, 842 to 845. The mandala itself shapes your consciousness just by looking at it. Tantric Buddhists believe you've started on the path to Tantric Buddhism. It's shaped your mind directly. Finally, the Tantric Buddhists employ the mudra. Now, these are old features of Buddhism, but now woven into a tight system of practice and thought in the Tantric tradition. And so we can think how our bodies convey the macrocosm, just as the mandala shows the mesocosm, where we think and feel with our eyes. We see these images as we're chanting the microcosmic mantra, looking at the mandala, which shapes our consciousness. Finally, our bodies themselves point to the macrocosmic truth of reality. And if I do this, most Americans know what I mean. Or if I do this, or likewise, if I do this, we know what I'm talking about. And then there are other ones that, well, frankly, have equivalents in Tantric Buddhism too. This one would be our middle finger when the image of the Bodhisattva is scolding you for your bad karma. So among these tantric superheroes of Tibet, and again, this will be the kind of Buddhism we see spreading from India to Tibet, then Mongolia, then finally, last stop, Manchuria. Among these superheroes figures, we've got Yeshe Tsogyal depicted here. She's naked. That's not allowed by the Indian conservative Buddhists. Why is she naked? Because she's given up all attachment in a way similar to the Digambara Jains we studied already. Although in this case, Yeshe Tsogyal is engaging in tantric intercourse. It is said, in fact, that once raped by several men, she didn't seek revenge. She was not harmed because her mind was crystal clear and awakened, and she, in fact, believe it or not, converted them all to Buddhism. And likewise, the guy who brings tantric Buddhism to Tibet's an odd character as well, Padmasambhava, whose name means roughly lotus power. Padmasambhava arrives in Tibet and subdues the demoness, it's claimed. He stakes her to the ground with his tantric magical powers. And to this day, these are pilgrimage sites where the original ogress who spawns the Tibetan people through union with a monkey is defeated by this Buddhist master. Here we can see Buddhism civilizing the culture and taming the local gods and goddesses, not really wiping them out, but this same kind of phenomenon we'll see with St. Boniface cutting down the tree of the Germans from their tribal phase. Then they move to the axial phase of religion, as the Tibetans do with Padmasambhava. Among the legends about this guy is that at one point in the king's entourage, he determined that some of the ministers were sympathetic to the original Pun faith, the tribal religion of Tibet, and so Padmasambhava takes his finger and shoots a ray of power at that minister, because he's kind of omniscient, believe it or not, and the minister is fried to a crisp. So we'll see martial arts in East Asia, but in Tibet and the Vajrayana nations, we're going to see a lot of what looks like magic and maybe hocus pocus or mumbo jumbo, if you want to put it from the words of my Japanese advisor. There are these biases, right, in all these cultures. And I guess the stereotype my Tibetan advisor had about the Japanese and Chinese Buddhisms was they're too simple. That happiness Buddhism, that's just kind of ridiculous. So the Tibetan, Mongols, Manchus, they develop a very rigorous scholastic tradition, memorizing really tens of thousands of pages of text. But we won't see martial arts practiced really among these Buddhists. They just don't see the purpose in that Taoist addition to Buddhism. And as we look at Padmasambhava himself, believe it or not, he's actually in union with Yeshe Tsogyal in this image. And the two are attaining super bliss states, having sex in the sky for 14 days. Believe that or not. And Padmasambhava, that smooth talker, he converted quite a few women in this manner. For these tantric Buddhists, then, there are many cosmic Buddhas. We saw that with the Mahayana, but now they're elaborated into many myriad meanings, types of Buddhas, their images, their colors, their objects, and all of this does look a lot like Hinduism, and it definitely is a hybrid. We can see really the workings of Shiva in Buddhism here. One Tibetan Lama, in fact, told me instead of coffee to wake up in the morning, he meditates on the image of Diamond Foot, and that gives him energy to get going in the morning. So that's kind of what these mandalas are. The gods and goddesses aren't gods or goddesses like Jehovah or Allah. These gods and goddesses are called mind impressions. So they're not real. They're real, though, as much as our consciousness itself is real. And so how does this tantric Buddhism then spread to the Mongols? Well, kind of simple, the Mongol Empire. The Tibetans were spared because by this time Buddhism's become a state religion in Tibet. The righteous kings have given away to really Buddhist leaders of this nation. And as the Mongols conquered Tibet, they kind of thought these people are holy, and they convert to Buddhism. And so we'll see Genghis Khan is in fact part of tribal phase of religion, Temujin as they called him, but his grandson Kublai Khan will rule all of China, and his advisor will be a Tibetan tantric Sakya Lama, in fact. And Chan and happiness or Pureland Buddhism kind of going to take second-class status until the Ming Dynasty emerges with our Shaolin Kung Fu generals leading the myriad millions of happiness Buddhist peasants. And not many are aware as well, the last Chinese dynasty was Manchu in nature, and the Manchu pick up the Tibetan style of Buddhism from the Mongols. So it's a domino effect across North and Central Asia. The Qing dynasty is the last one, Manchu was called. Also privileged Tibetan Buddhism, but now it is the Buddhism of the Dalai Lamas. Who are they? Dalai, in fact, is a Mongol term. A Lama means one possessing La, or spirit. And these are not just every Buddhist monk. They're not all lamas. They've got to be privileged. And so the Dalai Lamas emerge in real fact with the third one, but two others are said to have predated him, even though they didn't know they were Dalai Lamas. And so the idea is a bit like the old divine right of kings kind of concept in Europe, only even more so. The Dalai Lamas are, in theory, the bodhisattvas of infinite compassion, Avalokiteshvara. And so they are manifestations, again, Hindu avatar style, of that consciousness of that great Buddha, bodhisattva in our world. And believe it or not, there are said to be projections all around not only this planet, but many, many dimensions of this bodhisattva's compassion. And so by the 1500s, we'll see the fifth Dalai Lama makes Tibet a powerhouse and establishes the government as it exists today. Well, I like to think of him kind of like an Abraham Lincoln sort of guy. Not a founder like Washington, like the three early righteous kings who convert to Buddhism. By the way, after a great public debate between a Chan Buddhist and then an Indian Buddhist about really whether one can attain awakening gradually or instantly, as the Chan guys say, and about whether we really need to study a lot of scriptures, or, as the Indian scholar claim, or whether, in fact, studying scriptures will take you down a wrong path. And so this is the 14th Dalai Lama we have today, and he's the 14th because it's the 14th time, they believe, that he has manifested his great consciousness as a bodhisattva of compassion into this world to guide the Tibetan people, believe it or not. So to find a new Dalai Lama, well, the prior one, like the 13th, said, look for me in Mongolia. And so they did. But also, the state oracle of Tibet, wearing a lead hat of some hundreds of pounds, so that when he absorbs the power of 5 cosmic Buddhas, believe it or not, he doesn't explode. He predicts the birthplace of the next Dalai Lama as well, and frankly, the 3 wandering wise men of the New Testament story has more in common with this kind of Buddhist path than anything we really see in the rest of Christianity, or certainly Judaism, and it's not there in Islam. But a small committee then traveled to the regions predicted by the last one and by the state oracle, and bring with them several objects, the begging bowl or the robes and the like. And the little kid who can pick the prior Dalai Lama's goods is designated as the new Dalai Lama. And what many don't know is it's not just the Dalai Lama of Tibet, the ocean Lama, ocean of wisdom. But Mongolia has its own Dalai Lama, third in importance after 2 Tibetans in the hierarchy. And then, believe it or not, even governors of provinces were considered reincarnated lamas. So we, in the United States, we would have maybe our second Kennedy reincarnation if we were to deem him a great bodhisattva of compassion. Not only that, but governors of states would also be these reincarnated lamas chosen in this manner. So we can see this is quite a different Buddhism, focusing on the 7 chakra energy centers of the old Hindu and Indian view of the body. And even without sexual union, a practitioner can, in theory, merge the male and female channels in one's own body and dissolve them into the central channel of emptiness, this shunyata, or zeroness, in fact, and thus attain a full awakening in one's own practice. So the Dalai Lamas have no sexual partners to attain awakening. They can do that within their own minds. And believe it or not, the tantric guys can generate heat up to 115 degrees outside their body. And also, believe it or not, they can cast their consciousness into inanimate objects or birds and the like. That's a fast way to travel to India, as Marpa did by casting his consciousness into a bird, flying to India, finding a dying man, and taking over his body. So by now, if we look at the Indian Buddhism, we looked at the original Theravada. They stick to what the Buddha taught. But now the Northern, Central, and East Asian Buddhism's pretty liberal, I think, is clear. And also a wide divergence of practice and thought from Buddha's original, with the importation of Taoist elements in East Asian Buddhism and Hindu elements in this tantric Vajrayana Buddhism. So that is the nature of Buddhism beyond India.